Well, 1 o'clock or 1:30, I'm sorry? I forgot. 1 o'clock. Okay, so we've got half an hour, okay? And then we'll have another break for lunch. Okay. How's the speed? Are we going okay? Yeah. Okay. A lot of you are listening in English. Yeah, that's good. My accent is okay? Okay. All right. If you get a chance, read this paper. It is a very, very important paper. If your head coach does not believe in strength training, give him or her a copy of this paper. In particular, if you are working with female athletes. Evidence for non-genomic action of testosterone in skeletal muscle which improves athletic performance, implications for the female athlete. It also applies for the male athlete, but this was written about female athletes. Michael McGuigan, Professor McGuigan in New Zealand, leading researcher, was leading this group, one of his PhD students. Now I'm going to read this quote because I can't state it better in my own words, so I'm going to read it as a quote. Direct non-genomic. What non-genomic means is that these are effects which aren't related to the way in which the genes are expressed. We normally think of the genomic effects of testosterone. What that means is that the testosterone actually binds to the muscle cells. It then signals the DNA, the genes within the cell, to perform certain actions. Usually that is to increase protein manufacture. They're genomic actions. These are non-genomic actions. So these are actions that testosterone has that are not related to altering the DNA expression in the cell. Did I lose everyone? It's all right. Okay, direct non-genomic activation of calcium-mediated events. Calcium release and recovery is what drives muscle contraction, causes the actin and myosin to interact. Modulate significant physiological responses, acute modulation of force in individual fibres, prevention or protection against calcium-mediated fatigue. What this is saying is that if you have high levels of testosterone in the body, then this actually increases the force generation of individual muscle cells and improves their resistance to fatigue. That would seem fairly important to athletic performance. Okay. There is also a whole range of psychological effects of testosterone. Testosterone increases aggression, confidence, reduced anxiety and depression. Who doesn't want this in their athletes? Okay? Particularly the anxiety and depression one. Testosterone has very powerful effects on the brain. Cognitive function and memory are improved. We know this, it's irrefutable. We know in mice, if we take there's many studies which have taken male mice and castrated them. Almost immediately, well, within a few days, their cognition, their spatial awareness, their memory are all impacted negatively. Testosterone has a very powerful effect on the brain. It's particularly strong in female athletes, simply because their bodies are used to relatively low levels of testosterone. So if you do certain types of training which elevate that, all right, turns them into wolverines. But it makes them smarter, harder, faster, more focused, improves their performance. And that's quite apart from the effects, the genetic effects that testosterone has as well. I'm going to talk later this afternoon about a nice example in field hockey with the women's team leading up to the 2012 London Olympics. The really nice. Dave Hamilton was the performance manager at the time. He's since been poached by US field hockey, but I'll show you that example this afternoon. Okay, so I hope I've sold you on testosterone. It can be stimulated quite easily in men and women. It only takes probably 1 or 2 sessions per week. In season, one session is probably sufficient to raise their testosterone level, to get them in a more anabolic environment, to make the athlete more aggressive, more confident, reduce anxiety, reduce depression. It makes them smarter, they can learn skills more effectively. All right, that's why we have testosterone. Okay, we evolved with testosterone, particularly in men, simply so we could fight, chase after things, hunt, all the things that we need to do. But now we need to do it in the sporting environment. All right, it's a very natural evolution that we are playing with. Yes?
We can take that ideas for the teenagers also, with 14, 15, 16 years old?
It depends on their actual, no, it's not just their chronological age, but also their biological age.
Morphology also?
Yes, as well, naturally. But if they have reached puberty and their hormones have started to change, then yes, the system will respond. Once again, I think particularly in that age group, a little bit of strength training to stimulate testosterone is useful, if nothing else to help them with their skeletal and other soft tissue integrity. Reduce injury, I think, is very important for that age group.
I have a problem now with a child with 15 years old. He looks like 9.
Sorry, it looks like...
A boy with 15 years old?
Yes.
He looks 9 years old.
Yes, yeah, yes.
He has some what I can the puberty.
Yeah, delay.
Time.
Yes, yeah.
They need some catch up.
Yes.
With that. And the doctor told me that a little bit weights with not too much
Yes.
to exacerbate the testosterone. But that's why my question, if they helps or not.
Look, the world expert on this is Avery Feigenbaum. So if you look up any of Avery's work, you'll get a more definitive answer. But look, all of the research evidence is that strength training is very, very useful, particularly in rapidly growing children, because it helps their muscles to catch up with their growth. Quite often it's a problem if they're growing rapidly in height velocity and their muscle strength is not keeping up with it. Like kids get all gangly and not uncoordinated, and strength training seems to be very positive in terms of helping that. But it has to be appropriate strength training, and the use of bodyweight exercises in particular seems very effective.
Very, very air, 1 meter higher.
Yep.
Very, very delayed with the growth.
Yes. And look, I doubt that the strength training is actually going to cause stimulus of testosterone, and testosterone doesn't drive height. Okay, so you don't want to move him rapidly into high levels of testosterone, because that will actually make his final height lower. It'll make him shorter. No, sorry, he won't get shorter, but his final height will be less. So, but strength training, that's what I'm saying, strength training will not cause a surge in testosterone and cause his growth plates to close. It won't happen. Keep moving, I'm conscious of the time. Conversions of strength training. This is an interesting one because to take full benefit of increased muscle strength, you've got to adapt your coordination. I'll give you a good example. Imagine a race car driver, and the engineers work on the car and they increase the power output of the race car by 20%, which is easy to do through strength training in an athlete. 20% is no problem. Clearly, with 20% more power and torque in the car, the driver is going to have to practice with that car. How do you think they'd go if you just said, oh, we've tuned it all up for you, and bang, he's straight out in the race? He's going to be all over the place, okay? The driver has to practice with the new machine. So it's the same with an athlete. You make them stronger, initially their coordination will be wrong. The power flow will be disrupted. They have to actually practice with their new machine. So it's critical then that strength training is followed by exercise which allow the athletes to train with their changed muscles. This is another reason why I've had stories of coaches have come and said, oh, look, back in the 80s I tried strength training and my athlete, the next time he ran he was slow and everything like this. Yes, that will occur. If you train your athlete, you then have to teach them how to use their new machine, how to use their new muscles. It's very, very important. Another problem that may have masked the benefits of strength training is that you have a deceleration phase with traditional weight training. So if you have a look here, you have to stop at the top of the movement. Now, apart from doing a squat like that, I don't know of any other sporting activity where you actually stop at the top. When you sprint, you leave the ground. When you jump, you leave the ground. When you throw, the javelin leaves your hand. So there is a problem in training this way where you have this undesirable movement where you're stopping at the top, which is not specific to the actual target activity. This is a paper that myself, Kramer and Hakkinen published back in 1996. And it's just a comparison of doing a bench press, so just lying down on your back, a bench press, versus a bench throw where you actually throw and release the weight. This is the velocity of the bar. So you see that it increases and peaks about 70% of the way through the movement. This is bar displacement. 70% of the way through the movement, and then it slows to a stop because you have to finish the movement with the bar in your hand. And here is the force output. It's maintained, but at about 70%, the muscles switch off, and you're in fact actually slowing the bar up. That is not the motor pattern that you want to train to be sport specific. But when we allowed the athlete to throw the bar, you see the velocity increases, it's much higher, and it peaks at the point of release because they actually project it. And the force stays high throughout the movement, right up till the end, the force output. We term this ballistic because it's like you're releasing it, so it's a ballistic type movement. So here's your traditional squat. So a lot of coaches and athletes took this information and says, "I'll just do traditional movements quickly." But this encourages incorrect motor patterns again, because you're still accelerating the whole way through and then you're pulling the weight and slowing it. Once again, you're training inappropriate motor patterns, non-sport specific. It's far better to actually simulate the actual target movement, in this case a jump squat, where you're accelerating throughout the movement. And we've and other groups have run a very large range of studies showing great success with this ballistic type of training. I'm sorry.
Do you think that adding bands or chains will help?
Yes. Yeah. This is one way you can really effectively overcome this problem. Okay, in a lot of strength training, it's a really good technique is to actually put large elastic bands on the bar. And what that allows you to do is the athlete can accelerate the whole way through the movement right up to the end of the range. They don't have to physically leave the ground. So you can do that, simulate a quite ballistic movement without the problem of them jumping. The problem with them jumping is they've got to land. And we've heard a lot of athletes that way. I did one of my training studies for my PhD. We had athletes doing jump squats. And we had them jumping with 80, 100 kilograms on their back. These were sprint cyclists, so they were very strong. I broke every single athlete. Every single one. Coach was not happy. He was happy right up until the point I broke them because their vertical jump went through the roof. These guys were jumping 90, 100 centimetres in a jump and reach. Their vertical went absolutely through the roof, berserk. But they can't tolerate it. You can't land with 100 kilos on your back. They had shin splints. They got arch pain. They got knee pain. They got back pain. I broke every athlete. So very, very effective, but the problem is the landing. And that's why with chains and bands, they don't have to leave the ground, and so you don't have that problem of landing. Yes?
And in terms of assessments, for assessment purposes, would you recommend to do with or without jump? Because if you are doing an assessment of a speed squat without jumping, you are not sure if you are assessing the capacity of decelerate. And I mean in terms of power, if you have a transducer. Yeah,
every time we have them jump.
I tried both methods, with and without, and I found quite different results individual.
Yeah, you cannot. Okay, the question is, if we were testing their power output in, say, a jump squat, would you have them leave the ground? They have to leave the ground, or have to try to leave the ground. You can't leave the ground with 90% of 1 RM. No.
But then we will have that same problem that you need to, you cannot with 90% of your maximum repetition, but maybe with 75 or 70 they can put their feet out of the ground.
Yes.
So it's probably not good, and if you try to, and if you assess them every month, probably it would cause not so good. So it probably cause injuries. So
It depends on your athlete's experience. In my experience, if the athlete has been doing back squat and has a good history of back squat, it would be no problem to test them once a month using a back squat, with a jump squat where they actually leave the ground. We wouldn't normally test them in a jump squat with 75 or 90%. We would more likely test them with either 30 or 60%. So the loads would be less. And we would only have them do maybe 1 or 3 repetitions. It's highly unlikely that you'll injure them in that amount of work.
Okay, just one more question. Any difference in that, considering the injuries and assessing power, doing with the bar or with the back, or normally with back squat?
I'm
So
sorry.
using X bar to do the squat jump,
Yep.
or using a barbell on your back?
It depends on what they're used to. If they're used to back squat, we have them do that. A lot of our athletes that we work with, for example, with gymnastics or swimming, they've never squatted in their entire life. They can't squat terribly well. We may even have them just using a weighted vest or dumbbells, a more natural movement for them. Because as soon as, if you take an athlete who's never done a back squat, you put a bar on them and they're all over the place. It's just a dog's breakfast. Does that translate? I used to have a big dog, a Doberman, and when I give him breakfast in the morning, like a big can of dog food, I put it in his dish and he'd just go like this, and there'd just be food everywhere. So that's the saying, it's like a dog's breakfast. So no, we wouldn't put them in that back squat position. We'd have them in something that's easier for them to do. You can't be hard and fast in these things. You have to adapt it to what's going to work in your situation. Okay. So we've had great success with what we've termed ballistic resistance training. This is where the athlete actually jumps with the bar or actually throws it. And in part because it's novel for them, most athletes would never have done this, the performance gains that you get are very, very large. In fact, we showed in one particular study, which I did in 1994, with elite volleyball players. Many of these athletes were in the US national team. We produced a 6 to 8% increase in jump and reach. Now, if you train volleyball players, you'll know that that's most athletes would probably give their right hand to get that sort of improvement at that level, simply by doing this. They did nothing else. We didn't change anything else. We just had them doing this type of training. You put them in that ballistic movement, you load them, the neuromuscular adaptation that you get, even in a highly trained jump athlete, is quite large. The problem is controlling the landing, but we have systems that we use, braking systems in which to control that, and you can overcome that. The same with upper body. We've had fantastic improvement in swim time. These are elite swimmers, by them performing ballistic upper body training like that. Both bench throw, but also bench row as well. So this is a great, ballistic training is a fantastic way to actually transition the gains from traditional strength training into more sport-specific explosiveness. Question that's asked a lot is, okay, we're going to do ballistic training or power type training. Should I use heavy or light loads? Well, one of my PhD students, Jeff McBride, now at Appalachian State University, and we did a study where we looked at the effect of heavy versus light load jump squats on strength, power and speed. These are in athletic subjects, so they're already fairly well trained. One group trained with 30% of 1RM, the other group trained with 80% of 1RM. So that's in a back squat, performing jump squats. We then tested them on sprint time, agility, vertical jump, squat strength and squat jumps. I did the training because I believe if you're going to ask the athlete to do it, you have to be prepared to do it yourself. And I would have bet the house that the 80% would have been superior because it was harder. Training, jumping squats, it felt harder, it felt more intense. I thought we would have got a greater training benefit. The 80% training load, they actually got slower. Their sprint performance was significantly worse. They increased strength, no brainer, they got stronger. They increased force and power output during jump squats with the two heavy loads, 55 and 80%. They got but no change in 30% jump squat or bodyweight jump squat. Bizarre. The 30% training load, there was a borderline improvement in sprint performance. They actually got faster, they increased strength, although not as much as this group, and they increased velocity and power at all three loads. It's not what I expected at all. We got highly specific training adaptations to the lighter load. And so the papers we published from that, a lot of people then thought about training at the optimal load. We need to train using 30%. Many of you will have seen that and perhaps even used that yourself. Use 30% of 1RM as the overload to train ballistic power. And a lot of it was based on this study. So, would you only ever train at 30%? Yes?
What about eccentric training?
Eccentric training?
Only for the strength or anything more?
I'm going to talk about it this afternoon. Can you ask that question again then? Look, I think eccentric training is extremely important, but I've got a whole series of slides that I want to talk about. Yeah. So, I think that was, bloody hell, that's 12 years ago that paper was published and the study was done 15 years ago. Lots changed. Today you would not train with a single load. We also know that variety is very important in training our athletes. Our athletes, we will train them at 30%, we'll train them at 80%. We'll train them with body weight only. We change it, we undulate it, we periodise it. So the take-home message is 30% 1RM is a very effective load, but it's not the only load. You would train them at a range, a spectrum of loads is important. But that ballistic training is hard to implement. You quite often need specialised equipment, particularly if you want to train heavy. So the way in which most strength and conditioning programs have implemented ballistic training is to simply use the weightlifting style of training. Now, if you have a look at this, it's explosive, it's accelerative, it's highly functional. They're in a very functional body posture and movement. It's relatively inexpensive. Platform, barbell, a few plates, you're good to go. You can train large numbers of athletes simultaneously. And the other advantage is you're leveraging a lot of existing knowledge and expertise. There's a lot of weightlifting coaches out there who've had a lot of experience, they've got various levels of coaching, certification, and you can draw on that to train the athletes. So weightlifting style training forms the basis of a great many strength and conditioning programs worldwide, in particular in the United States, the UK and Australia. But there's also problems with it. It can be hard to teach, particularly in certain athlete types. Basketball and volleyball spring to mind. Okay, basketball players, amazing, incredible when they've got a basketball in their hand. Take the basketball away, I don't know what happens. They just everything goes to putty. Can't teach them anything. Clearly with very long linear athletes like that, the weightlifting movements are difficult for them to train. If they have poor technique, they can't lift much weight. It's very little benefit doing the weightlifting movements if you're lifting 10 kilos. It's not doing anything. Okay, for it to be effective, they have to be lifting a reasonable amount of weight. Also, time management. A lot of the groups I work with, I can't spend 3 years teaching them to do a decent high pull. We don't have that time. So there's that difficulty as well. How do you integrate it into the overall program of everything else they've got to do? And is it an effective implementation? Or in a lot of cases, it's a fashion that people are grasping hold of. Now, I'm not, we use a lot of weightlifting in our different training programs depending on the athlete. Okay, so don't get me wrong, I'm not bagging weightlifting, but it has to be actually appropriate to the setting, the type of athlete, their training background, etc. Right? We're not trying to make all of our volleyball, basketball players and swimmers weightlifters. That's crazy. Right? It's just one tool. But does it work? Now, I apologise if you've seen this video before, but I still love this video. These are a group of weightlifters. So clearly, weightlifting as an exercise and training regime is highly effective for increasing explosive power. So we'll add a few more plates and see if they can still do it. I like this little fella on the end. This is chest height. Is it genetics? You could argue that these guys weightlift because they have that ability to start with to be extremely explosive. I'm sure you'd love your volleyball players and basketball players to be able to jump that high, to have that same level of explosiveness of their lower body. I see that rarely. What I usually see is this when I go into various strength programs. So this is straight from Lance, and look, I hate to kick a man when he's down, but this is Lance doing hang cleans. Looks to the side, very important. No shirt, no shoes. Okay, so that's just worthless, absolutely worthless training. I mean, he's a cyclist, I don't know what the hell he thinks he's doing. It's just, the technique is horrible, and it's just a total and utter waste of time. So you have to, implement something which is effective and is done properly. Okay, weightlifting, those movements, that type of training may not be for your situation and for your athletes. So don't just jump on it because everyone else is doing it. Quite often I'm asked, how strong does my athlete have to be? How strong is strong enough? Is there an optimal strength? This is going to surprise some of you. This is some interesting data from 2012, Kiner's group here. Looking at different age, these are elite junior soccer players. Soccer players, not weightlifters. These are soccer players. They're German soccer players, but still, they're soccer players. At 12 years of age, they can back squat 70% of their own body weight. 150% at 15. By the time they're 16 to 19 years of age, the average back squat in this team was 2 body weights. I showed you data from the Australian Rugby Union. These are our national players. Right? A large majority of those athletes cannot squat 2 body weights, and yet we've got junior soccer players that can. Here's some other indications, some rough indications here for bench press, back squat, deadlift, power clean, as some suggested thresholds of what an athlete should have. This varies by sport. Clearly, for some very explosive sports such as triple jump, sprinting, sprint running, this needs to be way higher than 2 body weights. But as a rough guide, particularly for any field-based sports, so hockey, soccer or football, you're looking at 2 body weights, and this is why. There's a strong rationale that if you're able to lift 2 body weights on your back, you have 1 body weight here, your body, okay? 2 body weights on your back. Effectively, you are performing that movement with 3 times body weight. Now, you remember the first curve I showed you of the force, velocity, power relationship. Power is optimised when you are working at 30% of maximum strength or 30% of maximum shortening velocity. You can't change that, or you can slightly, but it's basic physiology. So if your athlete is involved in any ground-based activity where they've got to run or jump with their body weight, as a minimum, they should be able to back squat 2 body weights. Because then when they run and jump on the field or the court or whatever, they'll be operating close to their optimal power range. Motorbikes. Let's talk about motorbikes. Who's ever ridden a two-stroke dirt bike? Two-stroke dirt bike. Who's ridden a two-stroke dirt bike? A couple of people. They're fun, aren't they? Because they've got a power range. You put your throttle down, okay, and all of a sudden the thing goes and takes off because it has a very narrow power range. The human body's like that as well. There's an optimal power range that it likes to work in. It's around 30%. So that's why this strong rationale for 2 times body weight. Now, a lot of you will be sitting there going, oh, whoa, I'll never be able to get my athletes to squat that. But we've got 16-year-old boys, soccer players, that are quite comfortable squatting 2 body weights. It can be done. And certainly in Australia, I would say that the majority of our athletes are not strong enough for the sport that they're competing in. The majority of our athletes are not strong enough. It's pretty close to 1 and probably a good time to take a break, is it?
Yeah. The lunch is ready. I want to do lunch as well.
I'll have to get my...
5 minutes? 5, 10 minutes, okay.
5 to 10 minutes, okay? Okay. How are we all going? You guys all right? You got a question or anything? Hanging in there? I haven't demoralised you all, have I? No one's going to go out and give up the profession? Become a dentist or a florist? I can see a few florists in the audience. You look like a florist. I better not say that to the martial artist guy. Okay, hang in there, guys. You have to be strong first. I think there's a rush to move straight to power training, but a lot of work that we've done and other groups show that in the main you'd be better off to focus on getting them strong first. And this is a study that one of my PhD students, Prue Cormier, published. I published this with Mike McGuigan in Medicine and Science, Sport and Exercise in 2010. And what we did was we got a whole bunch of recreationally trained individuals. And some were strong, and these were people that could back squat around 2 body weights. Then we had a group that was weaker, only around 1.3 body weights of back strength. We then broke them up into a stronger group. They all did power training, and then 2 weaker groups that did power training or strength training, and then a control group. These 2 groups did power training for 5 weeks. We mid-tested them. Another 5 weeks of training, and we post-tested them. This group did strength training the whole way through. This is the power training that we did. Here it was mainly consisted of body weight and jump squats with 30% load on the back. These are the sets and reps. The strength training was a mainly lower body training involving back squat, 3 sets of 3 reps here at 90%, 75%, 80, etc., and the rest periods. I'll skip through this. I won't worry about the testing protocol. These are the changes that occurred in this is a change that occurred in jump squat performance here for the different groups. Stronger, the power training group and the strength training group. And what we see is, this is the, we'll have a look at peak power here. This is the change from baseline. All 3 groups improved. They all increased their peak power, jump height and the net impulse that they produced. Every single one of them. The control group didn't change. So whether you're weak or strong, if you do power training, you improve. If you're weak and you do strength training, you improve by the same amount. Sorry guys, we'll just skip over these couple here. So guys, in the interest of time, I'm just going to skip to this. These are some of the adaptations that occurred with this type of training. This is muscle size, so muscle thickness. What you'd expect. The 2 groups that did power training, no real change. In fact, the stronger group that did power training, their muscles actually got a little bit smaller. Very important message there. If you have already strong athletes and you put them in a power training program, these guys, we told them no more heavy resistance training. You have to stop resistance training for 10 weeks. they actually got weaker and their muscles got smaller. Very important take-home message. If you train your athletes to a certain strength level and then you move them into a power training phase, they still need to do maximal strength training at least every 7 to 10 days. If they don't, they will get smaller and they will get weaker, even though they're doing power training. So we'll come back to that a little bit later when we talk about in-season training. But interestingly, the weaker group that did strength training, their muscles got a lot larger. Their EMG went up quite markedly. Maximum activation went up in the strength training, a little bit in the power training. But in terms of rate of rise of EMG, how quickly they could switch their muscles on, no effect of strength training, but both of the power training, whether you're strong or weak, a considerable improvement. Take-home point here is that the adaptations that you produce are highly specific to the type of training that you do. And the adaptations to power training are different to the adaptations to strength training. So the question then is, and then we'll finish for lunch, is for a group of not so strong athletes, is it better to do power training or is it better to do strength training? So let's just delve into the results here. We had two groups, both for about 1.3 body weights in terms of their back squat strength. One group did strength training, one did the power training, and there's the training that they did. So let's have a look. What were the changes in maximal power output? This is the strength training group. We see an increase from baseline. This is the change from baseline. They increased by about 15% at 5 weeks and then about 23% improvement at 10 weeks. This is in power output. So in relatively weak athletes, you can give them strength training and they produce the same improvement in power output as a group that does power training. So in weak athletes, you don't have this differentiation of the effect. If you have a look across the different loads as well, they produce, the strength training or power training group produced similar improvements, except at the very heavy load here. At 80%, the strength training had a better effect. In terms of actual field performance, in terms of sprinting performance here, it looks like a better benefit for the power training, but it wasn't significant. Both of them improved their 40-metre sprint time, both groups. Maximal strength, of course, no change for power training, but the maximal strength training produced around a 30% improvement in 1RM back strength in that group. If we have a look now at the force-velocity relationship for these two groups, what we see, interestingly enough, is a shift. In the power training, we're seeing a shift mainly at the faster velocities here. But strength training, most of the change is at the slower velocities and higher strength. So highly specific adaptations, power training is producing improvements in velocity, strength training is producing improvements in force, but the end result is they both improve their power output because power is composed of force multiplied by velocity. The mechanisms that occurred, this is muscle thickness. We saw no change in muscle size from power training, quite a good improvement in muscle size from the strength training. Sorry about that. Lean muscle mass improved markedly in the strength training, not in the power training. Neural adaptations, maximal muscle activation, increased in both groups, but only significantly in the strength training. But the rate of rise improved much greater in the power training group. Again, highly specific neural adaptations as well. So that summarises that. The take-home message from this is that if you have athletes who are relatively weak, in other words, their back squats around 1 to 1.4 body weights, it is more effective to focus on increasing their strength first. Get them strong, rather than putting a whole lot of power training across them. Get them strong. Once they're strong, as you saw from the previous slides, they're better able then to adapt to strength training. So give them a foundation of strength first and then move them on to power training. So I think on that note, unless anyone's got a question. Okay, let's have lunch, eh? And then we'll come back after lunch. Thanks, guys.